Chapter 22, Behind the Scenes, 1890s. Sparkin' to court someone. He's been sparking her a while. In the year 1890, there were no Indian wars in the Ozark Hills, but the Wounded Knee Massacre happened as the year closed. The lands once open and occupied by the Native Americans were quickly being taken over by the U.S. government and given to immigrants to homestead. Benjamin Harrison was president, only serving 32 days, and died after having caught a cold and developing pneumonia. Alexander Ellick Harness had died of the same illness in 1860. The leading cause of death in the 1800s was pneumonia. Other diseases, such as influenza, tuberculosis, and diarrhea, accounted for many children's death under age 5. At about that time, 1890, rail companies were exploring the area. Mining interest in the area caused speculation and interest in finding valuable minerals in the hills. This would help fuel the interest in building a rail line through the rugged hill country of North Arkansas. A rail spur was completed to the resort town of Eureka Springs in 1883, but interest began to taper off by the end of the century in the Healing Water Resort. However, the mining and timber in the Ozark Hills drew railroad interest toward the end of the century. It would be another decade before the tracks were laid, but the St. Louis and North Arkansas Railroad reached Harrison, Boone County, in 1901 and Leslie, Searcy County, in 1903. Billy and Katie Harness had moved on to their new farm as the Progressive Age began in 1896. Progress was slow to come to those living in the hills of the Ozarks, but Billy was very aggressive about farming and had more land than he could possibly manage with a house of young girls and no boys. James Riley was born the following year, but Billy had to rely on farm help to grow his crops. Working from sunup to sundown was normal for those who farmed, but how risky it was to be a homesteader and have so many variables thrown at you that could be the difference between life and death. The Marshall Academy, a 2-story preparatory school with a belfry, was built and completed in Marshall in 1888. Academies were private schools and charged a tuition, but by the end of the century, taxes were beginning to be assessed on property for schools. The earliest public school is believed to have been a log building near Wiley's Cove, Leslie, and then Marshall, Old St. Joe, Canaan, and Witt's Springs. This makes me wonder if the Mint Pleasant School on Billy's farm was built of logs, and was it the first school in the Witt Springs area? As unions grew and became more powerful among industrial workers, so did an alliance of farmers who sought to have an increased money supply and price support for their crops. Farmers Alliance was the largest national organization that advocated for farmers and workers. Searcy County farmers grew in support of the advantages of organizing, and that created greater opportunities for growth. Agriculture began to diversify, and raising sheep or cultivating apples and peaches for the market increased the popularity of growing a cash crop. Instead of a host of yeoman farmers, the county was growing toward becoming producers for regional markets. Billy Harness became an apple producer with his mountain farm. As with every generation of men, the future and how our lives will be intertwined with others is an unknown. Yet as we look back at history, we see the providence of God, and it becomes apparent that a plan is being lived out according to a predetermined destiny. Many will call it chance, fate, or accident, but others see it as God directing the affairs of men. Is it being lucky, or is it divine provision? Some of the people who cross our path in life become influencers and companions. I want to drop back a few years and bring a couple of men into the narrative who play a significant role in the harness future. Let me begin in Wayne County, Tennessee, with a couple who moved to Bear Creek, Arkansas in the 1880s. Edgar Daniel and Nancy Jane White Wilbanks lived on the north bench of the ridge above Jenny's Creek Farm. Their daughter, Louisa O. B. 1875, married Andrew Treadwell, who lived on the east side of Lick Hollow. Another daughter, Martha Joan, Jody, married Giles Turney on February 14, 1901, and they homesteaded and lived on top of the ridge near the aforementioned people. Another daughter named Margaret L. B. 1886, married Butler Howell, B. 1889. These folks became part of stories yet to be told. Another influencer is Giles David Turney, who was born January 20th, 1880, in Cullman, Alabama, to David Daniel and Rachel Carroll Turney. Rachel was born in Georgia and was one of 15 children. Her oldest of two was Giles, who had a younger brother of 4 years named Daniel Washington Turney. The Turney ancestors came from Tournai, Belgium, which was formerly of France. Most Belgian people are Flemish, meaning they were Dutch-speaking Germans. Many immigrated to America in the 1850s due to hardships in the motherland. Several Turneys settled in Searcy County, and Turney's Cemetery near St. Joe, 1869, has over 30 of them buried there. An early doctor to the area was Dr. George Alexander Turney. Giles grew up on a farm but had conflicts with his father, and after becoming weary of it, he decided to leave home when he was 18 years old. A friend named Arthur Woods and Giles set out to go to an uncle named David Carroll, who lived near Bear Creek in Arkansas. The trip today is about 400 miles. It would be fascinating to know how they traveled and how long it took them. They would have had to cross the Mississippi River to cross over into Arkansas. Finding food and shelter probably required them to work at times to earn their keep. They were traveling near the year of 1889 when the land rush into the Oklahoma Territory happened. It's possible that immigrants from the east moving west helped them to find passage as an estimated 50,000 people reached the Oklahoma border and anxiously camped awaiting the signal to stampede the plains and stake a claim. The journey of Giles and Art was analogous of a popular book written in 1885 by Mark Twain about two young men, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Possibly, Edgar and Nancy Wilbanks were living on the north end of the ridge and David Carroll at the south end when Giles Turney went to the Ozark Hills. The Carrolls would have never met Giles until then. He would have had to introduce himself as a stranger and throw out some names starting with his mother, Rachel Carroll, who had married his father, David Daniel Turney, in Alabama. Apparently, Giles felt welcomed by the Carrolls and neighbors, so he stayed. But his friend Arthur eventually returned to Alabama. Perhaps Giles stayed partly because of meeting a neighbor girl named Martha Joan, Jody Wilbanks. There were few social opportunities to meet or court a girl living in improvised and rural Searcy County. With no parents to vouch for him, Giles would have had to prove himself, and maybe his Uncle David would give a nod of approval to Edgar Wilbanks to let him come to the house and sit with Jody. Sparking between couples was under great supervision and scrutiny with no touching. Holding hands was not permitted until permission was given for them to marry. On February the 11th in 1901, Giles met and married Martha Joan Wilbanks on Bear Creek. She went by the name of Jody and was born into a family of 10 children living in the Bear Creek community in 1882. Giles was 21 years old, and Jody was almost 19 years old when they were married. Jody's mother, Nancy Wilbanks, had died 4 years earlier, and her father, Edgar Wilbanks, continued to reside in the Bear Creek community. Giles and Jody registered a marriage certificate in Book F on page 236 on the 19th day of February in 1901 by W.F. Reeves in the Searcy County Clerk's office. It states that Walter S. Bull, Justice of the Peace, filled in the blank spaces and put his signature upon it on the 14th day of February. Giles was 21 and Jody was 18, making them of legal age to marry. The certificate had been acquired on February 11th. They got the certificate signed on the 14th by a J.P., and on the 19th it was filed with the county. When privacy was granted by the parents of the bride, the union of the couple was considered the act of marriage. This is the historic recognition of marriage throughout history and in the Bible. The intimacy of a man and a woman creates a bond for life. Their devotion to one another creates a nest for them to bear offspring. Giles prided himself in providing Jody with a home and food for her and the children. They began a homestead on a ridge south of Jenny Harness's Creek Farm overlooking Bear Creek to the north. This ridge became known as the Giles Turney Ridge. Today, the rocks from the foundation and chimney are still visible, as well as the hand dug well. I will leave the Turney progeny at this point and turn to another line of descendants in Searcy County that will intertwine with the Harnesses in days to come. Henry Lewis Ruff was the father of George Perry Ruff, who was born from his fourth wife, Priscilla McCutcheon Payne, a widow, in 1875. Henry Lewis Ruff died in 1904 and is buried in the Witts Spring Cemetery, having been the father of 8 children. His son, George Perry Ruff, probably lived on Richland Creek, but also lived at Witts Springs. He probably had very limited schooling, but was very crafty and skilled at making things of wood and metal. On February 28, 1811, George Perry Ruff married Ara C. Ari Gibson, the daughter of James Carlisle Gibson and Louisa Tucker. The couple lived to celebrate 66 years of marriage and the following children: Martha E. Ruff, Bertha L. Ruff, Richard Henry Ruff, B. 1901 D. 1986, James L. Ruff, Infant Ruff, William Garland Ruff, Earl G. Gibson, born to Elmer Gibson, a brother of Aries. When 6 months old, his mother died, and she raised him as her son. He married Verby Turney, daughter of Roscoe C. Turney. Richard Henry Ruff grew up in the Witts Springs area, where his father George Perry built and operated a water-powered mill on the edge of town. A dam was required to create a reservoir of water flowing from a source. A water gate regulated the flow to discharge down a sloped water trough, where it spilled onto a water wheel, filling its buckets with water and driving the wheel forward. The ancient harnessing of water for power was used extensively throughout the Ozarks, as an abundance of water was available to settlers. George Ruff's log-sided mill was built on a hillside on the edge of Witts Springs and was very small, roughly 10x14. The water wheel powered a flywheel that could turn a belt and power equipment. He had a grist mill for corn and a lathe for wood. More about this mill in Chapter 32. Reflection. As I connect the spiritual heritage of Jenny Harness to her children and her children with the Turneys and the Ruffs, it makes a quilt of patchwork. Lives are sewn into a whole that creates a covering and workmanship. One of my favorite terms from the Bible is the word remnant. As a quilt made of scraps, the remnants are made into a work of art. That's God's remnant. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Words of Joseph to his brethren. Genesis 45:7.